This is Reading Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, Chapter 10. Outside in the valley again, the sky is still limited by the bluffs on either side of the river, but they are closer together and closer to us than they were this morning. The valley is narrowing as we move toward the river source. We're also at a kind of beginning point in the things I'm discussing, at which we can at last start to talk about Phaedrus's break from the mainstream of rational thought in pursuit of the ghost of rationality itself. So a teenage Phaedrus comes across a passage by Einstein, which influences him very much, and it's from a 1918 speech that describes why men go into science. The majority go into it for ambition and for the superiority that this vocation demonstrative of intelligence brings. Others go into it because they just want the world to work better. But there's a third category, let's say, of misfits who... What brought them to the temple of science, no single answer will cover. Escape from everyday life with its painful crudity and hopeless dreariness from the fetters of one's own shifting desires. A finely tempered nature longs to escape from his noisy, cramped surroundings into the silence of the high mountains, where the eye ranges freely through the still, pure air and fondly traces out the restful contours apparently built for eternity. And of course, this describes why Phaedrus is taken to science. He has escaped to the high mountains. Phaedrus is in university studying biochemistry by age 15. And like many teenagers, he is idealistic. But possibly because he's an idealist, because he's entered the high mountains, he begins to question one of the most basic and definitely most mysterious mechanisms of the scientific method, the formation of hypotheses. Where they come from, no one knows. A person sitting somewhere, minding his own business, and suddenly, flash, he understands something he didn't understand before. Einstein had said, "Man tries to make for himself in the fashion that suits him best, a simplified and intelligible picture of the world. He then tries to some extent to substitute this cosmos of his for the world of experience and thus overcome it. He makes this cosmos and its construction the pivot of his emotional life in order to find in his way the peace and serenity which he cannot find in the narrow whirlpool of personal experience. The supreme task is to arrive at those universal elementary laws from which the cosmos can be built up by pure deduction. There's no logical path to these laws, only intuition resting on sympathetic understanding of experience can reach them." Phaedrus finds it odd that Einstein uses the word intuition and sympathy, words that denote subjectivity. After all, doesn't nature provide the hypothesis? Nope, says Einstein. It only provides the data, and man doesn't provide them either. Well, then who does? Nobody, says Einstein. So Phaedrus becomes interested in these hypotheses as things, as entities, as things themselves. And he realizes that there are no limits to the amount of hypotheses that can be generated to explain any given phenomena. As he was testing hypothesis number 1 by experimental method, a flood of other hypotheses would come to mind. And he was testing these, some more came to mind. As he was testing these, still more came to mind, until it became painfully evident that as he continued testing hypotheses and eliminating them, or confirming them, their number did not decrease. It actually increased as he went along. At first he found it amusing. He coined a law intended to have the humor of a Parkinson's law that the number of rational hypotheses that can explain any given phenomenon is infinite. It was only months after he coined the law that he began to have some doubts about the humor or benefits of it. If true, that law is not a minor flaw in scientific reasoning. The law is completely nihilistic. It is a catastrophic logical disproof of the general validity of all scientific method. So what Phaedrus determines is that if the number of hypotheses grows faster than the experimental method can handle, then it is clear that all hypotheses can never be tested. And this means that the scientific method cannot absolutely prove anything, which is exactly what scientific method purports to do, and that is exactly the worldview that Phaedrus has till this moment subscribed to. Einstein's solution that one answer is better than all the others at any given time seems weak to Phaedrus. The phrase "at any given moment" really shook him. Did Einstein really mean to state that truth was a function of time? To state that would annihilate the most basic presumption of all science. But there it was, the whole history of science, a clear story of continuously new and changing explanations of old facts. Scientific truth was not dogma, good for eternity, but a temporal, quantitative entity that could be studied like anything else. So what he learns from his studies is that the more you do science, the more hypotheses are generated. And the more hypotheses are generated, the shorter period of time between the time that conclusion from that experiment is deemed fact and a new scientific truth replaces that one. And as it turns out, it's the application of scientific method itself that is causing this dynamic, that is causing this rapidity, that is causing this exponential decrease in the time between when a scientific fact is considered a fact and when a new one replaces it. Through multiplication upon multiplication of facts, information, theories, and hypotheses, it is science itself that is leading mankind from single absolute truths to multiple indeterminate relative ones. The major producer of the social chaos, the indeterminacy of thought and values that rational knowledge is supposed to eliminate, is none other than science itself, and what Phaedrus saw in the isolation of his own laboratory work years is now seen everywhere in the technological world today. Scientifically produced anti-science, chaos. So the discovery has more than implications for science. He realizes that this has implications for all of Western society, since our whole way of seeing in the West, since the Enlightenment, has been based on reason, and that is the substrate of our society. The cause of our current social crises, he would have said, is a genetic defect within the nature of reason itself. And until this genetic defect is cleared, the crises will continue. Our current modes of rationality are not moving society forward into a better world. Well, in many ways, science has led to a better world. We now have control over nature to the extent that we have tremendously improved the quality of our, at least our material, our physical existence on the planet. But the division between the Romantics and the Classics come to the forefront here. The scientists, the classicists, the Enlightenment, the new atheists think that nothing is wrong with the system, that rationality is the best system, that this is the most advanced, most enlightened. The Romantics, the artists, are very ill at ease, the more spiritual types. So materially we're set, but spiritually not so much. You could call this, as Vervaeke calls it, a meaning crisis, and this is articulated by other people as well using different terminology, but a meaning crisis is a good way to put it. Now, this book was written 40 years ago, if you can believe that. He's speaking to us now. We were beginning to realize the downside of science at that time, though, the ecology movement and, just ways in which technology was beginning to isolate us. And of course, Zen in the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance goes into this quite a bit. Phaedrus didn't understand this attitude, didn't know what to do about it. It was as if he was contemplating that serene mountain landscape Einstein had described, and suddenly between the mountains there appeared a fissure, a gap of pure nothing. And slowly and agonizingly, to explain this gap, he had to admit the mountains, which had seemed built for eternity, might possibly be something else, perhaps just figments of his own imagination. It stopped him. He stops doing his schoolwork as well. How can he? He doesn't know what the basis of it is. So he's expelled from the university for bad grades, and this is attributed to immaturity. And in fact, this did happen. So much of this book, remember, is autobiographical. Just it's sort of tweaked for the it's a novel because it's not 100% autobiographical. It's tweaked to make the point, which is why, for example, Sylvia didn't like the depiction of herself. And John they were both made to be more airy-fairy and romantic than they actually were in real life. But in order to make the point, he had to have these characters be really kind of more one-dimensional than they actually were. So that's where the novel aspect comes in. So he's expelled from university for bad grades, and they say this is because you're immature, you're too young for this, even though you're very smart. But what really happened was this disillusionment. I mean, the basis of what he was in university for seemed to just crumble underneath him. And this destroyed his idealistic belief in the validity of science. And this is a belief that very few scientists ever question, by the way, even today. And the implications of the problem he had discovered were vast, and there was no clues as to how vast it actually was. So this is going to be continued. At Laurel, in sight of the mountains at last, we stop for the night. Sylvia and John and Chris and I walk up the long main street in the gathering dust and feel the presence of the mountains even though we talk about other things. I feel happy to be here and still a little sad to be here too. Sometimes it's a little better to travel than to arrive. So I hope that made sense, and I'll see you next Sunday for Chapter 11.